If you discovered an injured animal left to die in freezing snow, would you risk everything to save it? Prepare yourself for a heart-wrenching story of cruelty transformed by one officer's extraordinary compassion. This isn't just a rescue story, it's a testament to how a single decision can spark a wave of humanity that changes countless lives forever. On the coldest night of winter in Pinewood, Michigan, Officer Mark Lawson was finishing his patrol shift. Temperatures had plummeted to -15 degrees, and most residents were safely tucked away in warm homes. Heavy snow blanketed the small town in eerie silence as his cruiser's headlights cut through the darkness of the abandoned mill district. The dog, later named Hope, was a shepherd mix with matted fur caked with snow and blood. Visible ribs and open wounds told a story of prolonged abuse, culminating in this final act of cruelty, abandonment in deadly cold. In Officer Lawson's flashlight beam, the dog's eyes reflected a pain that transcended language, piercing straight to the officer's heart. Dr. Emma Santos had just finished cleaning her veterinary clinic when her emergency phone rang. At 34, she had built her practice from nothing, often working with rescue animals despite the financial strain. Tonight she had planned a quiet evening at home, unaware that her skills would soon be desperately needed for a case that would test the limits of her experience. Officer Lawson had moved to Pinewood 2 years ago after 8 years on the Chicago police force. At 36, the former Army medic had seen humanity at its worst during a tour in Iraq, but had never lost his fundamental belief in compassion as a force for change. Known for his quiet strength and fairness, he had quickly earned the town's respect. Pinewood itself was a community of barely 4,000 souls, struggling since the lumber mill closed. The winter festival planned for that weekend was their economic lifeline, bringing tourist dollars when they needed them most. No one could have predicted how an abandoned dog would soon unite their town in ways no festival ever could. The first sign something was wrong came when Officer Lawson's spotlight caught movement behind the old warehouse. A dark figure hurried away, leaving footprints in fresh snow, and something behind. Training took over as Lawson radioed dispatch with his position before investigating the suspicious scene that would change everything. Dispatcher Melissa Cole received Officer Lawson's call at 11:27 p.m. 20 years of experience told her something was wrong from the tension in his voice. When he radioed again minutes later, his normally calm tone was tight with controlled rage. "I need animal control or a vet immediately." The urgency in his voice told her this was no routine call. As Officer Lawson approached cautiously, his flashlight revealed dark fur against white snow. The dog made no attempt to flee or show aggression. It simply curled tighter into itself, as if trying to disappear. Fresh blood stained the snow around its battered body, and distinctive marks showed deliberate abuse rather than accident. Linda Parker, a local nurse driving home from her hospital shift, noticed police lights near the warehouse district. Pulling over, she grabbed her emergency kit and approached Officer Lawson, who knelt beside the injured animal. "Animal control's at least 30 minutes out," he explained grimly. In this temperature, that might be too late. Their eyes met in silent understanding. Waiting wasn't an option. "We need to get this dog warm now," Linda said, her nurse's training kicking in as she assessed the situation. Hypothermia was setting in fast, the dog's shivers growing weaker, a dangerous sign. She spread her emergency blanket on the snow while Officer Lawson removed his police jacket, creating a makeshift stretcher. "The closest emergency vet is 40 minutes away in Westridge," she explained, already dialing Dr. Santos's clinic. "But I know someone closer." Moving the injured animal required extraordinary care. Each whimper that escaped as they gently lifted him onto the blanket-jacket combination sent a wave of fury through Officer Lawson. 15 years of law enforcement had hardened him to many things, but deliberate cruelty to the defenseless still ignited a righteous anger he struggled to contain. "I'll find whoever did this," he promised quietly, more to himself than to Linda or the suffering dog. Dr. Santos answered on the second ring, immediately alert despite the late hour. "Bring him in through the back entrance," she instructed after Linda's rapid explanation. "I'll have everything ready." The clinic had officially closed hours ago, and protocols dictated emergency cases be referred to the regional animal hospital. But something in Linda's description, or perhaps the officer's involvement, told Emma this couldn't wait. Some decisions transcended protocols. The trail of blood-tinted paw prints leading to the warehouse told a story Officer Lawson intended to follow, but not yet. The dog's survival took precedence over evidence collection. "I'll secure the scene and come back," he told dispatch, requesting another unit to preserve the area. With gentle hands that belied his imposing frame, he helped Linda carry their precious cargo to his heated cruiser, the dog's labored breathing hanging like small clouds in the frigid air. The dashboard clock showed 11:42 p.m. as they pulled away from the warehouse, Linda cradling the dog's head in her lap while keeping pressure on the worst of the visible wounds. "Stay with us," she murmured, her voice catching as she felt the animal's tremors intensify. Officer Lawson drove with controlled urgency, emergency lights clearing their path through empty streets. The radio crackling with updates from dispatch. Another unit was en route to secure the scene, and Mayor Richards had been notified of the situation. Inside Pinewood Animal Clinic, Dr. Santos moved with practiced efficiency, transforming her examination room into an emergency treatment center. Her assistant, Jesse Torres, had arrived within minutes of her call. Sleep still evident in his eyes, but hands steady as they prepared IV fluids, heating pads, and trauma supplies. "Sounds like a bad one," he commented, noting the unusual late-night emergency. Emma nodded grimly. "Prepare for everything: hypothermia, blood loss, possible internal injuries." As Officer Lawson's cruiser pulled up to the clinic's back entrance, Mayor Richards was already receiving concerned calls from council members awakened by the emergency radio chatter. "An animal abuse case? Tonight of all nights?" Councilman Peterson complained, his focus on the impending winter festival rather than the emergency itself. "We don't have resources for this, especially with animal control out of town." The mayor's grip tightened on his phone as he made a decision. "I'll handle it personally," he said before hanging up. The moment Dr. Santos saw the shepherd mix carried through her door, she knew this was one of the worst cases of her career. Beyond the obvious wounds and dangerous hypothermia, the dog's eyes revealed a deeper trauma, the broken trust of an animal who had known only human cruelty. "On the table," she directed, her professional mask firmly in place despite the emotion threatening to break through. "Jesse, start warming fluids and prepare for emergency blood work." Officer Lawson stood back as the medical team took over, his imposing frame suddenly seeming lost in the small examination room. Blood from the dog stained his uniform pants and covered his hands, evidence of a crime he was professionally obligated to investigate, though personal involvement complicated matters. "I need to document the injuries," he explained, lifting his department-issued camera. "Doctor," Santos nodded without looking up from her immediate task of inserting an IV line into the dehydrated animal. Linda provided what little context they had while assisting Dr. Santos with the initial assessment. "The tracks suggest he was dragged to that location," she explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. "And these wounds," she gestured to distinctive marks on the dog's muzzle and flanks, "they're not accidental, Doctor." Santos nodded grimly as she worked, cataloguing injuries both fresh and old that told a story of sustained abuse rather than a single incident. The dog, who still had no name beyond the victim in Officer Lawson's preliminary report, struggled to maintain consciousness as the medical team worked around him. Each touch, even the gentlest, elicited flinches that spoke of expected pain. Yet despite everything he had endured, he made no attempt to bite or growl. A remarkable restraint that struck Dr. Santos as both heartbreaking and hopeful. Animals with fighting spirits often recovered against the odds, and something in those pain-filled eyes suggested this one might be a fighter. Mayor Richards arrived at the clinic just as Dr. Santos was finishing her initial assessment. His presence surprised the small group. The mayor rarely involved himself in police matters, especially at midnight on the coldest night of the year. "What's the situation?" he asked, his tone deliberately neutral as he took in the bloody scene and the grave faces of those present. Officer Lawson straightened, years of military and police training evident in his posture as he prepared to brief his superior. "Deliberate animal abuse, sir," Lawson reported, his professional tone belying the emotion evident in his clenched jaw. "Blunt force trauma, possible burns, evidence of prolonged neglect followed by abandonment in life-threatening conditions." His camera displayed images documenting each injury, building a case that would eventually lead to criminal charges if they found the perpetrator. "The scene is secured for evidence collection, and I've requested additional resources to track the suspect who fled the area." Mayor Richards listened with growing concern, but his focus kept returning to the dog fighting for life on the examination table. As the head of a small town with limited resources, Richard Thompson had made countless difficult decisions balancing needs against budgets, often choosing pragmatism over sentiment. Yet something about this case, perhaps the sheer cruelty evident in the animal's wounds, or the dedicated professionals working so hard to save a stray, stirred something deeper than administrative concerns. "What do you need?" he asked Dr. Santos directly, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. The standard protocol would be referring the case to county services once the animal was stabilized, minimizing town expenses and liability. Instead, the mayor found himself volunteering resources they barely had, driven by an instinctive response to the suffering before him. Dr. Santos looked up from her work, her expression revealing momentary surprise before returning to professional focus. The turning point came 3 hours into that long night, when Dr. Santos finally stepped back from the examination table, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "He's stabilized," she announced to the small group that had remained at the clinic. The dog lay swaddled in warming blankets, IV fluids slowly restoring his hydration, wounds cleaned and bandaged where possible. But it was his eyes, now able to focus and track movement around the room, that told the real story. Against overwhelming odds, he was fighting to live. Officer Lawson had left briefly to coordinate the evidence collection at the warehouse site, but had returned to the clinic instead of going home after his shift. Now, he stood beside the treatment table, one hand gently resting near the dog, but not quite touching him. "Does he have a chance?" he asked quietly, the question containing layers of meaning beyond the immediate medical prognosis. Dr. Santos understood what he was really asking. Was this suffering animal too damaged physically and emotionally to ever recover a normal life? "He's stronger than he looks," she replied, measuring each word carefully. "The next 24 hours are critical for his physical recovery, but I've seen cases like this before." She paused, meeting Lawson's intense gaze. "The bigger question is what happens after the medical crisis. He'll need extensive rehabilitation, both physical and behavioral. The county shelter is already overcrowded, and cases like this..." She didn't need to finish. They all knew the grim statistics for severely traumatized animals in the overcrowded system. What happened next would later be described by Mayor Richards as the moment that changed everything. Officer Lawson moved his hand slowly into the dog's line of sight, palm open, a silent offering of contact that respected the animal's right to refuse. For several breathless seconds, nothing happened. Then, with visible effort, the injured shepherd lifted his head slightly and extended his muzzle toward the offered hand, nostrils flaring as he took in the officer's scent. The gesture, small as it was, represented an extraordinary leap of trust from a creature who had every reason to fear human touch. "I'll take him," Lawson said simply, the words emerging before he had consciously formed the thought. The room fell silent as the implications of his offer registered. Taking responsibility for a traumatized animal with an uncertain medical prognosis was no small commitment, especially for a single officer with irregular hours and no experience in canine rehabilitation. Yet something in the connection forming between man and dog made the decision feel inevitable rather than impulsive. Dr. Santos hesitated, professional caution warring with the hope blooming in her chest. "Mark, this isn't going to be easy," she said gently, using his first name rather than his title for the first time that night. "He'll need specialized care, possibly surgery depending on how these injuries heal. The emotional trauma alone could take months or years to address. Are you sure you've thought this through?" Her concern was genuine. She had seen too many well-intentioned adoptions fail when reality proved harder than anticipated. Mayor Richards, who had remained largely silent during the treatment process, surprised everyone by supporting Lawson's decision. "The town will help," he announced, the administrative caution that typically characterized his leadership temporarily set aside. "Medical expenses, specialized training, whatever it takes." His unexpected advocacy transformed what might have been dismissed as one officer's impulsive decision into something larger, a community commitment to healing what had been broken. Linda Parker, who had stayed well past the end of her hospital shift to assist with the emergency, captured the moment on her phone. Officer Lawson kneeling beside the treatment table, the injured dog making that first tentative connection. "Do you mind if I share this?" she asked, already envisioning how the image would resonate with her network. "People should see that something good can come even from situations like this." Lawson nodded, too focused on the dog to fully register how that single photo would soon catapult them both into unexpected spotlight. As dawn approached, bringing weak winter sunlight through the clinic windows, critical decisions about the dog's future had been made that would ripple far beyond that room. Dr. Santos would coordinate a comprehensive treatment plan involving specialists from neighboring Westridge. Officer Lawson would take family leave to focus on the initial rehabilitation. Mayor Richards would establish a special fund for medical expenses, starting with his personal donation. But perhaps most significantly, the nameless dog had been given both an identity and a future. "He needs a name," Jessie observed, carefully adjusting the IV line as the sky lightened outside. The suggestion broke the solemn mood that had settled over the exhausted group, prompting tired smiles as various options were considered and discarded. Miracle seemed too predictable, Lucky too trivial for what he had endured. It was Mayor Richards who suggested Justice, a name that acknowledged both the cruelty he had survived and the investigation that would hopefully bring his abuser to account. The name resonated immediately with Officer Lawson, who had spent his career pursuing justice in various forms. "Justice," he repeated, watching as the dog's ears twitched slightly at the sound of his voice. The name carried weight and meaning, but also a promise that what had happened in the snow behind that warehouse would not be forgotten or minimized. For the first time since they had found him, the dog now called Justice seemed to relax slightly, his breathing deepening into something approaching normal sleep. While Justice rested under careful monitoring, Officer Lawson finally stepped outside to coordinate with the investigation team. Dawn revealed what darkness had hidden, a trail of blood and paw prints leading from a battered pickup truck abandoned behind the warehouse to where they had found the dog. Inside the vehicle, evidence technicians discovered more blood, dog hair and a heavy chain that matched marks on Justice's neck. Most significantly, the truck's registration provided a name, Connor Matthews, a former Pinewood resident with prior complaints of animal neglect. Back inside the clinic, Dr. Santos was explaining Justice's condition to a newly arrived specialist from Westridge Veterinary Hospital. The radiographs show 3 fractured ribs, a hairline fracture to the left femur, and possible damage to the right hip joint, she detailed clinically, though her eyes betrayed the emotion behind her professional assessment. More concerning are the neurological responses, delayed pupil reaction, sensitivity to light, possible concussion, and then there's the psychological trauma, which may present the greatest long-term challenge. The specialist, Dr. Rainier, listened with growing concern as he reviewed the medical images. "I've seen abuse cases before, but this level of calculated cruelty..." He trailed off, shaking his head as he examined the distinctive pattern of injuries. Someone wanted this animal to suffer before they left him to die. His blunt assessment silenced the room momentarily before he continued in a more hopeful tone. "The good news is that nothing appears irreparable. With proper treatment and care, physical recovery is likely. The emotional healing will take longer, but his willingness to trust Officer Lawson suggests remarkable resilience." Word of Justice's rescue spread rapidly through Pinewood as the morning progressed. Linda's photo, shared to local community groups with a brief explanation, triggered an immediate outpouring of support. By noon, the clinic's phone was ringing constantly with offers of assistance, donations for medical bills, volunteers to help with rehabilitation, information about the abandoned truck and its owner. What had begun as one officer's solitary decision in the snow was transforming into a community-wide mission, uniting Pinewood's residents in a way that transcended the usual social and political divisions. 3 days after Justice's rescue, Officer Lawson sat on the floor of Dr. Santos's clinic, hand-feeding small pieces of soft food to the recovering dog. The transformation was already remarkable. Justice's eyes tracked movement alertly, his tail gave occasional tentative wags, and most significantly, he had begun accepting gentle touches from the small circle of humans he was learning to trust. Local media had picked up the story, transforming both the abused shepherd and the officer who saved him into symbols of resilience and compassion that resonated far beyond Pinewood. "He's ready to go home," Dr. Santos announced after completing her morning examination. The words carried enormous weight, Home meaning Officer Lawson's modest house on Elm Street, which had undergone hasty modifications to accommodate a recovering canine patient. Volunteers had constructed a special ramp over the front steps, donated an orthopedic dog bed, and stocked the kitchen with specialized foods and medications. An entire community had mobilized around Justice's recovery, turning one man's compassionate choice into a collective mission. The investigation into Justice's abuse had progressed with unusual speed, driven by public outrage and a solid evidence trail. Connor Matthews had been arrested at his brother's apartment in Westridge, initially denying any involvement, despite the overwhelming physical evidence linking him to the crime. Faced with potential felony charges under recently strengthened animal cruelty laws, he eventually confessed, revealing a disturbing pattern of escalating violence that had culminated in the brutal abandonment. His confession provided closure, but also raised troubling questions about how previous warning signs had been missed. Justice's journey home from the clinic became an impromptu parade, with well-wishers lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the dog whose story had captured their hearts. Officer Lawson drove slowly, acutely aware of the precious cargo carefully secured in a specialized harness on his back seat. For a man accustomed to avoiding attention, the public nature of this adoption felt strange but not unwelcome. Justice's case had touched something fundamental in Pinewood, creating connections across the usual divides of politics, class, and circumstance. The first night at home presented challenges neither Lawson nor Justice had anticipated. Unfamiliar surroundings triggered the dog's anxiety, manifesting in trembling and restless pacing despite his injuries. Lawson sat on the floor beside the orthopedic bed, reading aloud from a paperback thriller in a calm, steady voice until the early hours of the morning. By dawn, man and dog had reached a fragile equilibrium. Justice finally sleeping with his head resting against Lawson's leg, the officer dozing in an awkward position he would feel in stiff muscles the next day. Dr. Santos had prepared Lawson for the likelihood of setbacks amidst progress, but the reality tested his resolve nonetheless. Some days Justice seemed to make remarkable strides, accepting a gentle brushing, showing interest in short walks around the fenced yard, even playing tentatively with a soft toy. Other days brought regression, cowering at sudden movements, refusing food, the return of the vacant stare that had characterized their first meeting in the snow. Each step backward felt like personal failure until Dr. Santos gently reminded him, "Healing isn't linear. Trust the process." Meanwhile, Pinewood itself was experiencing an unexpected transformation centered around Justice's story. The Winter Festival, typically focused on ice sculptures and local crafts, incorporated a new element, a fundraiser for the newly established Justice Fund, supporting animal welfare initiatives. Mayor Richards, recognizing the community-building potential, allocated space in the town square for rescue organizations to showcase adoptable animals. What began as one dog's tragedy had catalyzed a broader awakening to the needs of vulnerable animals throughout the region. 6 weeks into Justice's recovery, Officer Lawson returned to full-time duty with an unusual accommodation, a specially trained service dog in training. Dr. Santos had suggested that Justice's intelligence and growing bond with Lawson might be channeled into formal service work, providing the dog with purpose while addressing his need for constant reassurance. The police chief, initially skeptical, became a convert after witnessing how Justice's presence de-escalated a tense mental health call, the dog's calm demeanor somehow communicating safety to a distressed teenager where words had failed. The Justice Fund, originally established for one dog's medical expenses, had grown beyond anyone's expectations through donations from across the country. Linda Parker's photo and accompanying story had gone viral, touching hearts far beyond Pinewood's borders. With the surplus funds, Dr. Santos established a specialized rehabilitation program for abused animals, while Mayor Richards championed stronger county-wide animal protection ordinances. What began as one officer's impulse in the snow had rippled outward, creating systemic change that would benefit countless animals. Connor Matthews received the maximum sentence allowed under state law, 3 years imprisonment with no possibility of early parole, plus substantial fines. The judge's unusually harsh ruling cited the calculated cruelty evident in Justice's case and the need to establish meaningful consequences for animal abuse. Officer Lawson attended the sentencing hearing with Justice beside him, the dog's physical recovery visible in his filled-out frame and healing wounds. More remarkable was the emotional recovery evident in how Justice calmly navigated the crowded courtroom, no longer defined by fear. As months passed, Justice's story faded from headlines, but remained alive in Pinewood's collective memory and ongoing initiatives. The shepherd mix, who had once been left to die in the snow, now accompanied Officer Lawson on community outreach visits to schools, where children learned about animal welfare and responsible pet ownership. Justice's gentle acceptance of small, careful hands offering treats became a powerful lesson in resilience and forgiveness, qualities that resonated beyond animal welfare contexts into Pinewood's approach to community challenges. For Officer Lawson, the most profound changes were the quietest ones. The solitary routine that had characterized his life since moving to Pinewood had expanded to include evening walks with Justice, weekend training sessions with Dr. Santos, and regular visits from community members who had become friends through their shared investment in the dog's recovery. The apartment once described by colleagues as barely lived in now held evidence of a shared life. Dog toys, specialized equipment, and framed photos documenting Justice's transformation from victim to survivor to thriver. Dr. Santos, whose professional caution had initially made her skeptical about Justice's prospects, became one of his most devoted supporters and a frequent visitor to Lawson's home. Her expertise guided his physical rehabilitation, while her emotional investment in his case provided moral support during difficult periods. What began as a professional relationship evolved into something neither had anticipated, a deep friendship built on shared purpose and mutual respect, with Justice as both catalyst and beneficiary. Mayor Richards, reflecting on the one-year anniversary of Justice's rescue, summarized the impact in his address at the Winter Festival. Sometimes the measure of a community is found in how we respond to cruelty with kindness, to destruction with healing. Justice came to us broken, and in saving him, we discovered something essential about ourselves. The speech resonated deeply with Pinewood residents, many of whom wore small paw print pins symbolizing their contribution to the Justice Fund and its ongoing work. Officer Lawson, never comfortable with public speaking, nevertheless found himself addressing the festival crowd with Justice sitting calmly at his side. "A year ago I made a split-second decision that changed my life," he acknowledged, one hand resting lightly on Justice's head. "But what I've learned since then is that healing takes time, patience, and community. Justice isn't just my dog. He belongs to all of us who believed he deserved a second chance." The shepherd, as if understanding his role in this moment, stood tall beside the man who had saved him, his once fearful eyes now clear and confident. 2 years after that fateful snowy night, Justice trotted confidently alongside Officer Lawson at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for Pinewood's new Animal Welfare Center. The shepherd mix, once near death in the snow, now wore the distinctive vest of a certified therapy dog, his remarkable journey from victim to healer complete. As cameras flashed and the mayor delivered his speech, Justice remained focused on his handler, the bond between them evident in subtle communications that required no words. Dr. Santos stood nearby, professional pride barely containing her emotional response to the moment. The state-of-the-art facility represented the culmination of a vision born in those desperate hours, fighting to save one dog's life. Now thousands of animals would benefit from specialized medical care, rehabilitation services, and a revolutionary adoption program focused on matching traumatized animals with properly trained owners. What had begun in tragedy had transformed into a legacy that would change countless lives. The Justice Fund had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations, attracting corporate sponsorships and foundation grants that expanded its reach throughout the region. Linda Parker, whose photograph had first captured public attention, now directed the fund's educational outreach, bringing Justice's story to schools and community groups as a powerful lesson in compassion and resilience. The ripple effects continued to expand, touching lives far beyond Pinewood's borders in ways no one could have predicted on that cold winter night. Perhaps most remarkable was Justice himself, who showed no lasting signs of the trauma that had nearly claimed his life. The physical scars remained, a slight limp in cold weather, the distinctive pattern of healed wounds visible when his fur was wet. But the emotional healing had been complete and profound. Children who knew his story marveled at his gentle acceptance of their attention, unable to reconcile the horrific abuse he had suffered with the calm, affectionate animal who now visited their classrooms and hospital wards. Officer Lawson had undergone his own transformation, his naturally reserved demeanor softening through his partnership with Justice. Colleagues noted how his approach to policing had evolved, emphasizing community connection and restorative practices over punitive measures. Senior officers from neighboring jurisdictions requested his input on animal abuse cases, recognizing that his experience with Justice provided insights unavailable through conventional training. What had begun as a career detour had become a calling that gave new meaning to his work. Connor Matthews, meanwhile, served his full sentence without early release, the judge's unusually harsh ruling holding firm through several appeal attempts. Upon release, he found himself facing a community unwilling to forget or minimize his actions. The requirements of his parole included mandatory counseling, addressing the connection between animal cruelty and other violent behaviors, a program developed specifically in response to Justice's case and now implemented statewide. Justice's legacy included not just healing for victims but intervention for perpetrators. Mayor Richards, reflecting on his unexpected championship of animal welfare, often cited Justice's case as the moment that redefined his understanding of public service. Sometimes leadership means recognizing when an issue transcends practical considerations, he explained to a journalist, profiling Pinewood's transformation. Justice taught me that some decisions can't be reduced to budgets and protocols. Sometimes we need to lead with our humanity first. The philosophy had reshaped his approach to governance, earning him unprecedented support across political divides. For the residents of Pinewood, Justice had become more than a beloved local celebrity. He represented their collective best selves, a living reminder that community meant showing up for the vulnerable when it mattered most. Children who hadn't been born when Justice was rescued grew up knowing his story, the annual Justice Day celebration at the Winter Festival, ensuring the legacy continued for new generations. T-shirts bearing his image and the simple phrase "Choose Compassion" became Pinewood's unofficial uniform, worn with pride by residents of all ages. Dr. Santos, whose professional expertise had been crucial to Justice's survival, found her career forever altered by his case. Requests for her specialized knowledge in rehabilitating traumatized animals came from across the country, leading to published research, speaking engagements, and eventually a groundbreaking program training veterinarians in addressing both physical and emotional trauma. One case changed everything, she often noted in her presentations, showing before and after images of Justice that never failed to move audiences to tears. As Officer Lawson and Justice walked through the completed Animal Welfare Center that winter afternoon, they paused before a simple plaque in the entrance hall. It bore Justice's photo, not the viral image of his rescue, but a recent portrait showing him alert and confident, alongside words that had become Pinewood's unofficial motto: "Compassion is a choice we make every day." The shepherd looked up at his human partner, tail wagging gently, embodying the truth that from the darkest beginnings can come the most profound light. If only we are brave enough to choose compassion when it matters most.